Now, the BuckeyeXtra podcast with Joey Kaufman and Rob Aller from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hey, folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, with your weekly scouting special podcast. And this is an extra special one because it is a BuckeyeXtra Mind Your Banners collaboration with my good friend Joey Kaufman over at the Columbus Dispatch. Joey, like me, married into a new pal family. I think like me, a family that is stunned at what New Pal football has become on the east side of Indianapolis. But we are here to talk about a game, Joey, that is going to be happening in the heart of downtown on Saturday night. Indiana, Ohio State, or maybe more correctly, according to the rankings, Ohio State, Indiana. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I imagine this is the only podcast out there that's co-hosted by New Pal by marriage. Co-hosts. Have
you ever had Frosty Boy? That's kind of the rite of passage in New Pal.
I have several times. It closes for the winter, so we won't be able to get any on our drive west.
There used to be a little cafe right next door to Frosty Boy, which I think maybe is a Mexican restaurant now. It was called Cafe 52 because it was on US 52, and my wife worked there in high school. And they made this thing called a ranch dipper, which was, I think, 3 different kinds of cheese, well-cooked bacon on white bread with ranch dipping sauce. And it was horrible for you, but it was the best tasting thing I think I've ever had. I've tried creating it at home since, and they are all pale imitations. So shout out to Cafe 52, gone but not forgotten. Number 1 versus number 2. I mean, you know, it feels like we're all going to be talking about this game in different ways this week. But the first thing I think, Joey, to say is just like, probably since Indiana beat Oregon, this is the game everyone's wanted to see. And you know, Indiana, I don't think got to number 2 until maybe a couple weeks later. I'm trying to remember the exact sequencing of the rankings. But we certainly could recognize from pretty early on that Ohio State was the best team in the country. And I think when Indiana wins at Oregon, we sort of decide, at very least, these are clearly the 2 best teams in the Big Ten. And as the season's gone on, they've emerged as, I would argue, the 2 best teams in the country. And, you know, it sounds simplistic, but like, games like this are just fun for college football, and you don't get a ton of them. This is the first conference championship game that's been 1 versus 2 since, I believe, 2009 between Florida and Alabama. Curt Cignetti mentioned, he made a point of mentioning he was on the staff for those 2 Florida-Bama games that were 1 versus 2. Of course, Ohio State, Michigan in 2006 was the last 1 versus 2 in the Big Ten. Like, it just looks like a lot of fun. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's so rare, even in the history of Big Ten championship games, to actually get the 2 best teams in the conference meeting in this game. And not only do you get, I think, what are 2 of the clear best teams in the conference, you get the 2 best teams by rankings in the country. So big step up from what we've seen in the past with Ohio State going to Indianapolis, playing a 9-3, 10-2 Big Ten West team.
I think, as someone who wrote the rather angry obituary for the Big Ten West after that 2023 game where Iowa, I think, crossed the 50 on 1 drive against Michigan, I don't really miss the divisions. And if anything, frankly, I mean, these last 2 years, right, have been a pretty good 1 versus 3 and 1 versus 4 has been a pretty good endorsement for the idea that the Big Ten was good. Okay, maybe did they need to go to 18 teams to get there? I don't know, but to get away from divisions, I think has been good for the conference.
Yeah, and it worked out neatly this year where if Ohio State had lost to Michigan last Saturday, and you can start getting into the tiebreaker scenarios. But this is just a very clean two perfect regular season teams, 2 12-0 teams. It's a very neat matchup in terms of the tidiness of the records.
I wanted to start, if we're talking about matchups, and I referenced this on our podcast earlier in the week, and I don't remember who. I never remember because it flashes across my face too fast for me to note anything. But someone pointed out there was a moment in that Michigan State game where I think it was 2nd and 5, and Michigan got called, I think, for a holding penalty. And Ryan Day declined it. And he just sort of said, I mean, with his action, he was saying, I don't think you can get 5 yards. And obviously the analytics would have told him to accept it, that 2nd and 15 is a more advantageous situation than 3rd and 5. but it felt like it spoke volumes about what Ryan Day thinks about his defense and maybe just what he thinks about his team in general. That, okay, Michigan maybe was playing its best football at the beginning of November, not the end, but you're in Ann Arbor. The weather's not great. It's one of the biggest rivalries in the sport, and you just sort of say, I think we're tougher and stronger and more physical than you. Prove me wrong, and Michigan couldn't. That felt like if I'm looking for a moment to encapsulate Ohio State defensively this year, that felt like about as clean of sort of a window into it as I can. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty good, I think, encapsulation of where they're at, just the confidence they have overall in that side of the ball, which allowed just 93 points throughout the whole regular season. I mean, this is a defense that really has been good from start to finish. I think you could pinpoint so many different things. I think it's a great one. You could start it even in week 1 against Texas, where they were able to make a goal line stand that was critical in that win. I think that's really probably the most impressive thing about this defense. If you want to just take a wider lens, it's what's made them so good this year is they just tighten up in situations. They're tighten the screws in certain situations. But Michigan had 3 drives that got within Ohio State's 30-yard line. Ohio State held them to field goals all 3 times. They just do a good job in situations where you wonder, they might be in some trouble here, and they just hold. They're the best red zone defense team in the country. They just do not really give in very easily. I think it's just Matt Patricia's enhanced the defense in a lot of ways, but that is a carryover from last year and sort of a culture that Jim Knowles instilled in them. His saying was, if you give us a yard, we'll defend it. That was sort of a mantra for them in the past, and I think it's kind of held true this year, where they just don't give up stuff easily, even when they're in some precarious situations.
And I mean, they don't, in particular, and this is kind of relevant to Indiana, they do not give up explosives. They are first in the conference in fewest plays of 10, 20, 30, and I think 40 yards allowed this year. Like if you beat it, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I sort of want to ask, about kind of the Indiana versus Ohio State defensively at all, because I think, it feels like, I think the phrase we used on our podcast is like Ohio State's dominant and Indiana's disruptive. And Indiana's numbers look good. Don't get me wrong. Indiana's numbers defensively are very, very, very good this season. But with Ohio State, it's just like it feels like everything's a struggle. Like getting a first down is a struggle. Getting across the 50 is a struggle. Getting points on the board, like Ohio State makes you just like bleed for everything defensively.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair for what Ohio State does defensively, and that's been the way that they've been recent years. They're sort of top the FBS and stop rate. It tends to fluctuate week in and week out, but they're really good on third down and getting off the field. Really good in stop rate. You'll see other defenses in the country. They're not like Texas Tech or Oklahoma or A&M, sort of those teams that are just going to pile up a bunch of sacks or even get a ton of takeaways. They're just really solid, fundamentally sound. They can get pressure, not to say they don't, but you're going to find other defenses nationally that are more havoc-wreaking than Ohio State. Ohio State just sort of holds its spot on the field and has really the players to do it. It doesn't maybe always have the flash in terms of the picks or the sacks or the TFLs, but they just don't give up a lot of yards.
How do you think that contrasts with Indiana? Because Indiana has a lot of that. I mean, Indiana has forced a lot more turnovers this season. I mean, Indiana has 19 more tackles for loss than any other team in the conference. I can remember having conversations with people ahead of that Oregon game about, is this going to be a challenge for Indiana's defensive front? And Indiana sacked Dante Moore 6 times. Like, Indiana's calling card this season defensively has been, we're going to get you into bad down and distance situations, and then we're going to make you play football the way we want you to play football. We're going to confuse you with zone. We're going to control the line of scrimmage. We're going to, blitz when you don't expect it, whatever. Just like, how do you think that kind of compares? And maybe on the flip side, because Indiana has seen, I don't think a defense as good as Ohio State, but it has played at Oregon. It has played at Iowa. Has Ohio State seen a defense that is maybe as disruptive as Indiana's is, even if maybe it's not quite as physically dominant as maybe Ohio State can be, if that's fair?
I thought Michigan had the chance to be one, just how strong they were up front, but Ohio State was able to run the ball really well against them. I think for the Buckeyes, it's just the second half of their season, second half of their regular season, has just been really light in terms of the quality opponents they played. Michigan had been the first team with a winning record that they had played since Illinois, so they have not gone up against really a ton of quality Big Ten defenses this year, just because of the way the schedule broke and the unbalanced scheduling of it all. They didn't have Iowa. And Penn State wasn't what we thought Penn State was going to be when the season began. So this is probably the best defense they've played since Washington, maybe Illinois. It's maybe Michigan in there too. I think that'll be a thing for Ohio State that's still worth watching, just because of the way the schedule turned out to be.
Well, I guess that kind of begs the question then of Julian saying what Ohio State asks him to do in this game. What do you think he's capable of? I mean, watching from afar, I felt like I saw Ohio State almost just like trust him more and more every week. That as the season wore on, it felt like they were willing to put more on his plate. Eventually, I know they, Bo Jackson. I love his name's Bo Jackson. Like as the stepson of an Auburn grad, I love that there's a running back in this game named Bo Jackson. But even as good as he looked, I think at times, especially in the second half of the season, you felt like more and more Ohio State sort of said, "We win with Julian. We score. We move the ball. We score the ball. We win with Julian saying." What do you think Ohio State tries to do basically to make his life a little bit easier in a week like this, if this is, as you said, potentially sort of the most difficult defense he's going to face this year, or at least, well, to this point anyway?
Yeah, I mean, they have put more on Julian Saint's plate throughout the year. They really brought him along this season in such an interesting way, because the last time Ohio State had a redshirt freshman quarterback as young as this was C.J. Stroud, and they sort of threw him into the fire. Their defense was not in a place where you could slow the game down and make it easy for him. And C.J. Stroud came out in 2021 throwing the ball all over the place and throwing a ton, because Ohio State's defense was such that you needed to score 30, 40 points, it felt like, to win games. And this year they brought Saint along a lot more slowly than Stroud. And I think in recent weeks they've allowed him to do a little more. They've been willing to take a shot. I mean, the play that kind of encapsulates it is 4th and 5 at Michigan, where they had the ball in the 35, and they go deep with Julian Saint to Jeremiah Smith in that situation. I mean, I think that shows level of trust. They have him as a downfield passer. Ohio State will have Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith available for this game after they return to Michigan, so that helps. The cast of playmakers they have is a little wider, and I think you saw a little more of them working in Bo Jackson into the passing game last week. So I think when they're fully healthy, there are a lot more targets for him to lean on. You have Max Clare, the Purdue transfer, who can throw the ball all over the place. And even if he is pressured, he gets rid of the ball really quick. There was a play against Michigan where Bo Jackson, or he flipped to the Bo Jackson, sort of a swing pass, same time as he was getting hit from behind with a free edge rusher. So he can get rid of the ball really quickly. I think this is going to be a fun quarterback matchup as well. As from your standpoint, how has for the Ohio State fans, how has Mendoza compared to what they had last year in Rourke?
Yeah, I mean, Mendoza is like Fernando Mendoza is, I mean, and this is no slight on Curtis Rourke. He's a better quarterback than Curtis Rourke was. Now, I think Rourke had some consistency that, especially as I think, Rourke was a 6th-year player by the end of last season. That especially with the way that Indiana kind of ran its offense, they passed to run a little bit more last season than they have this season, and so that meant that you had a lot more of sort of Curtis Rourke on timing throws and things like that. And so there were moments when Rourke maybe seemed a little bit more consistent. The flip side is, even though Mendoza has had shaky moments in, the Penn State game, certainly the Iowa game, the Oregon game, number one, obviously he's won all of those games and he's led. I mean, he has been really good on the game-winning drive of all three of those games. But number two, you are, I think, presented a whole body of work now because Rourke played 12 games last year. Mendoza's played 12 games this year. Presented a whole body of work to compare. I think you are also allowed to point out fairly that Mendoza's played a tougher schedule. That, that Indiana in the regular season this year has played, or in that 12-game stretch, has played, a playoff team, an 8-4 Iowa team, an 8-4 Illinois team, a 6-6 Penn State team on the road. Even, I guess, if you want to stretch it out, because there was so much discussion of Indiana's non-conference schedule, two of those teams they played wound up winning 9 games. So, Mendoza has played a tougher schedule. And while at times maybe the lows have felt a little bit lower, in part because I think Indiana has felt okay opening things up for Mendoza a little bit more, the highs have obviously been a lot higher. And, it's you don't want to oversimplify it, but Ohio State fans will remember that Rourke just could not find anything in that game in Columbus last year. He struggled similarly for long stretches in the Notre Dame game in the playoff. His numbers in that game wound up looking okay, but a lot of that comes in garbage time once Indiana's kind of chasing. Mendoza, will he be the number one pick in the draft? I have no idea. I'm not smart enough on that stuff. But, he makes NFL-level throws when he's in a rhythm, when he's at his best. I think in the game, what turned out to be the game-winning drive at Oregon, I think he was 5 of 7 for 62 yards and a touchdown. And that was right after he'd thrown the pick six to let Oregon tie the game. So, he goes from kind of the worst moment of the game to just the knockout blow on the very next drive. He has trouble with pressure. Most quarterbacks do. I think the difference with him is that he will admit that, he doesn't say it this way, but I will say it this way. As a quarterback that got sacked 41 times in 12 games at Cal last year, there are moments when you kind of, you see some of that pop back up, right? You see some of that sort of, he calls them bad habits, start to manifest themselves again. And he gets a little bit rushed. He'll start locking in on receivers. He won't kind of trust his offensive line to take the time to go through, 3 and 4 reads, because a year ago he probably just didn't have the time to do that. But if Indiana can get him in any kind of rhythm, then, I don't think it's unfair to say he's as good as any quarterback in the country. And he's obviously got a little bit of the dual threat to him as well. I think he's got something like about 350 sack adjusted rushing yards. He's rushed for, I think, 6 touchdowns now. And saying, the numbers for a Heisman contender are low, but that's largely because he's not throwing passes in the fourth quarter. I think I haven't looked at Purdue and Wisconsin and added them to this stat, but, he was still involved in the offense in the fourth quarter of the Old Dominion game because it was closer than it should have been. And then obviously the Iowa, Oregon, and Penn State games. The other 6 games through the first 10 weeks, he threw, I think, 9 passes in the fourth quarter in those 6 games combined. His brother has thrown substantially more fourth quarter passes this season than he has. And so the numbers kind of, one of the things that intrigues me about both these teams, full stop, but both these quarterbacks, is it's felt like both of these coaching staffs, the minute they felt like they could just sort of press the eject button and just say, we're done today, they've done that with the quarterbacks, with the defenses. It almost feels like both of these teams have successfully taken at least one full game out of a lot of their best players' legs because they've been able to go into fourth quarters and just say, we're done now. And that has affected some of Mendoza's statistics as well.
The thing that Ohio State's also done this year is they just operated at such a tempo where it's not only do they sort of pull the plug on things early in games, but they just operate at such a pace where Sagan comes out of the games where he hasn't had to throw all that much relative to what guys were doing years ago when Ohio State started moving at a slower tempo to sort of preserve themselves for the playoff. I think Cignetti said on the Big Ten teleconference on Sunday, it almost feels like Ohio State plays in a sense of where it's holding something back. And this is the type of game where it feels like, It's indoors. It's for the Big Ten title game. If they change their pace or they do different things with tempo, I think that's something to maybe watch for as well.
That's actually something I wanted to ask you, and this is sort of, philosophical. I got a chance to watch Ohio State at Purdue. I saw you up in West Lafayette. I was driving to Chicago for the basketball game against Marquette, and I just stopped in West Lafayette. And I feel like I've seen this with Ohio State this year, where it is very apparent how dominant they are, not just talent-wise, but like scheme-wise, and guys are in the right positions. And, you don't feel like there's ever a moment where anybody's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole or anything like that. And yet, it feels sometimes like I expect Ohio State to be like one touchdown better than it should be game to game. And listen, Indiana's run up some scores this season just because their second and third string offense can run the ball. And so if you go back and look at some of these games where they're putting up, 55, 56 points, it's literally just like freshmen, redshirt sophomores. But because they run the ball so well while they're trying to bleed out the game, they're still scoring a couple extra touchdowns. And so I guess what I'm saying is the flip side is you can kind of artificially inflate your number a little bit too, right? That you can, Indiana rushing for 100 yards and 2 scores or whatever it was in the fourth quarter against Purdue isn't going to have a lot of bearing on whether or not Indiana can beat Ohio State. It just makes that number look a little bit bigger because Indiana's 2s and 3s execute so well against, the bad teams' backups that they're facing in the fourth quarter of these games. But is there a sense that you as you kind of referenced there, that like there's like an extra 5% somewhere that Ohio State can reach for and activate if it needs to?
It's felt that way because that's how they sort of scripted things last year, whereas it felt like they had not really hit their full potential until the college football playoff, and they started to operate with a little faster pace and started to throw the ball a little more aggressively in terms of the shots downfield they were willing to take. So that it was a formula that worked for them a year ago. It's felt almost like for the last year or so, like they sort of have treated the regular season like NBA teams treat the regular season. You sort of work through and preserve your health and sort of the wear and tear for the playoff run. We haven't seen the difference with this team from a year ago is they're playing the Big Ten title game. They weren't in that situation last year. So how much do they push it this stage or not, knowing that the stakes are a bit lessened, even though they have said all this week they think it's advantageous to be the 1 seed. They have not been here since 2020, so they're playing for hardware. Last week they get gold pants for beating Michigan. Now they want a silver trophy as well. So maybe we'll see them push it a little more.
I mean, that is like, I think I was the one that asked Ryan Day about this, and we've asked Kurt Cignetti in various ways about this. Like I was looking at some of Indiana's snap count numbers, for guys who were mainstays last year versus this year. And of course, injuries are a factor and all that. But, there are guys that are down like 125, 150 total snaps, from where they were a season ago. Because like early in the year, we talked about how Indiana didn't rotate much defensively and how, Indiana's starting 11 defensively with a couple of exceptions kind of played the whole game. But then you'd get to the end of the game and you realize they only played 45 snaps or 47 snaps. And, it strikes me, and I think maybe, at least from Indiana's perspective, I think that the cleanest sort of example of this is Mendoza. But it almost feels like there's a developing formula now in college football, which is, whereas your season, maybe 13, 14 games a few years ago now might be 15, 16. You need to almost kind of like plan for a second season starting December 1 if you're going to be a team that's competing at this level. And so maybe you do a little bit like, you talked about handling like an NBA team. Feels a little bit like NFL teams to me too, where it's like, we don't need to win this game with a whole bunch of style points. We just need to win. And once we can kind of put this thing in cruise control and start protecting some of the guys that we don't want to see worn down at the business end of the year, we can do that. Whereas, it's not for everybody. Indiana last year was running up scores. I mean, they will more or less tell you they were because they felt like they had to, because they knew they didn't have quality wins on their resume. This year, I know the score looks like it, but they're not doing that. They are pulling starters basically the minute either the score gets big enough or the opponent starts to as well. And it seems like there's a concerted sort of effort to keep these rosters fresh, not just because you want to be fresh for Indianapolis on December 6th, but because you want to be fresh, recognizing that your season can play, almost like an extra 2 months, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, what is the title game? January 20th?
20th, I think, yeah. And also, you're not going to get, I don't want to pick on anybody, but you're not going to get like a Maryland in there. You know what I mean? Like you might play like a 12 seed or something, but you're not going to get in all likelihood, you're not going to get a game where you can pull all your starters at the end of the third quarter in the playoffs. So you got to be as sort of steady as you can be for a game like this.
Yeah, I think Ohio State, the way the season began, because they banked the win over Texas so early, honestly, it felt like after they won that game that they were a shoe-in for the playoff. And at that point, they were playing for seeding, because once you were 1-0 with the win over Texas and look at the remaining schedule, even at that time, thinking Penn State was going to be maybe a national championship contender, you could see it was hard to picture more than 2 losses left on the schedule, or even the threat of 2 losses. So I think it really eliminated the need for sort of style points. You already had a win over Texas to start the year, so you could just kind of work on what you needed to work on.
What is and I doubt Ryan Day was getting questions about this during Purdue week or whatever, but at least just sort of like in the Ohio State orbit, what is the sort of developing perception of Indiana been this season? Because again, I think from Indiana's perspective, Curt Cignetti said somewhere in the last few days, he's done 3 press conferences since Friday night, so I can't remember which one is which, but he kind of talked about, Indiana recognized it was kind of, sort of lurking in the shadows. There was some doubts after the way that the Notre Dame and Ohio State games went last year. They kind of had to prove some things this season. He kind of pointed at that Illinois game as a real pivot point, because everyone thought, in the preseason, Illinois is this year's Indiana, and Indiana obviously, I think, had a point to prove going out in that game. But it probably isn't until Ohio State. Well, with the exception of not Ohio State, Oregon, with the exception of one guy that was in our podcast basically all summer saying if Indiana does not beat Penn State and Oregon this season will be a disappointment. So shout out to that guy who more or less called this from the IU side. But it probably isn't until the other side of the Oregon game that I think Indiana fans really start to believe that Indianapolis is not just an aspiration, but a likelihood. Whereas, to your point, I think Ohio State starts the season feeling like we're the best team in the country, beats Texas, just keeps kind of steamrolling from there. Like, what has been sort of the developing perception of Indiana on the Ohio State side of things from your perspective?
Last year was funny because I remember when Ohio State beat Indiana at home the week before the Michigan, and it didn't really feel as if they had much respect for them, in the sense that you saw the video board at the shoe troll Cignetti with the, hey, Google it. You saw them add the late touchdown. You saw Will Howard on the sideline sort of smoking a cigarette, pretending to smoke a cigarette butt and then stomping it out. You saw them take a pleasure in beating IU, and you felt like maybe this was just some sort of, the impression that I had was that they felt as if IU was sort of this team that was going to talk and be a little bit of a nuisance, but not really be able to have the kind of the punch to match it. And this year, the way they have talked about Indiana, you feel a little more respect from their side because they've had staying power. This was not just sort of a one-hit wonder type of team, and the fact that they have had their first perfect regular season, or first 12-0 season ever.
Yeah.
One-year team that sort of took its shots at Ohio State and then went away. That's been, I think, the most striking thing. Because even Ryan Day has mentioned a couple times this week that, like, Stignetti said, Google me, and everybody jokes about it, but hey, he's right, he wins. So I think the record is just so overwhelmingly impressive to them at this standpoint. You almost have to tip your cap in that sense. So they're right there with Ohio State. The thing I'm going to be interested in this game too is just, it felt like still last year you could feel the talent gap. I mean, the way Big Ten games are decided are really still in some ways is we talk about Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate all you want, but last year you think about just how dominant Ohio State was physically up front, and that's the thing I wonder about with this matchup is how does Indiana sort of hold up again against them, and just what sort of year-over-year improvements have they been made. But I think as far as the respect is there, it's just whether this is going to prove to be a real heavyweight fight.
I think that the big question for me, because I mean, this was the question going into the Oregon game, was essentially like what the line of scrimmage would look like. And you know, Iowa is Iowa. I mean, Iowa at Iowa is like it is a distinct challenge in the Big Ten to basically anything else you have to do. But Indiana in that game at times didn't look great, right? I mean, more sort of offensive line than defensive line, but at times it felt like Indiana was maybe getting pushed around a little bit in that game. And you sort of wondered if some of what you're talking about from last season was creeping in. And then they went to Oregon and they sacked Dante Moore on the first snap of the game, and they just never stopped. They were in Oregon's backfield all afternoon. They sacked Dante Moore 6 times. I think they had 9 tackles for loss. They've had something like 4 different games of 10-plus tackles for loss this season. Maybe the biggest question I have is, can Indiana pressure Julian Sand? And then concurrent to that, and I mentioned this in our podcast, we sort of said if you remove like the obvious players, the quarterbacks or Jeremiah Smith or whoever, who's a player that if they have a great game, you think maybe that helps define their team winning the game? I said D'Angelo Pons, because what Indiana will want to do is play a lot of D'Angelo Pons man-to-man, and then everybody else in zone, pushing everything to the outside the other way. And I don't know that it necessarily matters whether Pons is on Jeremiah Smith or Carnell Tate, in the sense that either one of them can really hurt Indiana. And if they get into single coverage and Pons can't win that matchup, then it becomes a problem, and it really starts to disrupt what Indiana wants to do from a coverage perspective. But if Pons can even just man-to-man, take one of those guys out of the game, a decent amount of the time, and let Indiana do what it wants to do with sort of its pressure schemes, plus the way it mixes its coverages, that's the chance I think Indiana has, is can Indiana get pressure on Julian Sand, and then can Indiana win a one-on-one matchup somewhere, probably through D'Angelo Pons, that lets them kind of throw the more confusing sort of mix-up zone coverages they've had a lot of success with at Sand while he's under pressure. Because if they can't do those two things, then it does feel like it's going to be another game where Sand, we come out the other side and he's 26 of 33 for 250 and 2 or 3 scores. And, if you can't get him out of rhythm, then I think you're going to struggle if you're Indiana. But if you can, then again, maybe you have the opportunity to make Ohio State play the game on your terms a little bit more defensively. And that's where I think, because I think Indiana, to win this game, I think Indiana's got to get some short fields. Like, one of the things they just could not do last year was flip the field on Ohio State. And they, Indiana fans can fairly point out that it was 7-7 at the end of the first half, and then 2 sort of uncharacteristic special teams mistakes turned the whole game around. But I mean, they were inside their own 25 basically every time they had the ball. They couldn't move it. They couldn't flip the field. They could not gain field position advantage. I think they've got to try and find a way to do that in this game. Maybe it's on special teams, but the way they've done it most consistently this season has been havoc plays, sacks, tackles for loss, and turnovers. And I think they've got to find a way to at least do some of that against Ohio State.
I mean, that's the biggest challenge, I think, just to beating Ohio State this year is Julian Sand does not turn the ball over. He's 30 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. They are one of the best in the country at protecting him. Only Army has allowed fewer sacks, and they're not exactly dropping back all that much there in West Point. So that to me is nobody's done it yet. There's not really, you can't point to any game this season where it's felt like this team showed something in this stretch that really seemed to bother Sayin. I mean, he's sort of been unflappable for most of the season. The one pick he threw in Big Ten play, you were there at Purdue, where he just kind of fit the ball in a bad spot in the red zone. I mean, that is where if I have a hard time imagining saying that, just having a situation where he is all that flummoxed. But there have been times where Ohio State has not capitalized on drives in the red zone either. That's where saying it has tended, if he is going to throw a pick, it's been in the tighter area. And that's where Ohio State does struggle at times to sort of punch it in some short yardage situations. So that I think that is the area to, if you are trying to draw a scenario where Ohio State is vulnerable, it's them not capitalizing on drives and coming away with field goals instead of touchdowns, because they're going to move the ball. It's inevitable, and maybe you get some disruption in the pocket. But I think there's a limit to probably how much is realistic to expect. But there have been times this year where they just have not punched it in drives, and they have the explosive plays to overcome some of those situations. But that's sort of what I would be on guard for Ohio State, is just, you saw the first when they were down 6-0 at Michigan. They were down 6-0. They made it 6-3, and that came after 6 plays where they were stuck at the 3-yard line. So that will be, I think, another interesting matchup for just Indiana's front. They have a good defensive front. Can you hold in those spots as well? Because Ohio State has not always been able to muscle its way through.
Do we think, as we kind of wrap toward a close here, I mean, I think we have to ask this question in some form ahead of this matchup. Do we think the winner of this game wins the Heisman Trophy behind center? I checked because I know Gannett, USA Today company, prefers we use BetMGM, and not encouraging. I always say this: not encouraging anyone to bet. Always, please gamble responsibly. There's a pretty clear front three going into this weekend, which is Sayin, Mendoza, and Diego Pavia, who are all separated by like percentage points in the odds. And I think the next closest is Jeremiah Love, who's, like plus 2,500 or something. And obviously he's not playing this weekend. So, a lot of these players have sort of run out of opportunities to sort of showcase themselves as Heisman contenders. Do you think the winner Saturday, even if they don't necessarily play their best game, wins the Heisman, or do you think there's a world where this door could get kicked open for somebody else?
I think if Mendoza is on the winning side, I think it's a slam dunk, because they'll have defanged Ohio State, the reigning national champions, who were also unbeaten in 25. And that storyline of the quarterback leading Indiana to number one and beating Ohio State for the first time since the 1980s, I think would just be too irresistible for Heisman Trophy voters. I think if it's Sayin and just he's okay and Ohio State wins, I think he still probably wins it. I think it's sort of a Troy Smith-esque type of season where he's just the star quarterback on the team that's number one at the end of the regular season. But I think that I think it will be easier for voters to rubber stamp Mendoza than Sayin. I think there'd be a little more doubts, and I think maybe Pavia gets some second looks from voters.
I think that's fair. The thing that's hard for me to get past is, like, the analytics are going to like Mendoza and Sayin more than Pavia, and I've come around on Pavia. I was a Diego Pavia skeptic, frankly, at one point this season. I've come around on Pavia. I think he's the best playmaker of the three. But Sayin is much more efficient than he is. Mendoza on raw output has almost matched him, certainly in touchdowns. Has more moments, which we can debate the flaws in the Heisman process, but Mendoza has those moments that I'm not sure Pavia has. Mendoza already has better wins than Pavia has. If Sayin wins on Saturday, he will have a better win than Pavia has. And the biggest thing for me is just that Pavia's not playing. And like when you're talking about such small margins, and I think this is going to wind up being the closest Heisman vote in years. When you're talking about such small margins, being able to leave voters with, being able to have kind of the last word, which is that there's going to be a picture of you holding up the Big Ten championship trophy on a stage in a shower of confetti at 12:04 a.m. Sunday morning. It just makes it very hard for me, because Pavia does not get some kind of counter argument this weekend, to believe that we wind up overlooking Sayin or Mendoza. If they're both just really bad, maybe, and maybe then we start talking about like vote splitting in the Midwest, and I'm not smart enough to get into all that. But to me, it is difficult to look past the narrative that has been built around this game, and in a lot of ways justifiably so. I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say these have been the two best quarterbacks in the country this year. I don't think that's unfair. And if you want to have a conversation about why one of the running backs isn't, in the conversation, sure. I mean, I am personally of the opinion that the best player in college football is Jeremiah Smith, and unfortunately, he's not going to get anywhere near New York. But if the conversation is narrowed to those three, I think it's going to be hard for Pavia, without getting sort of one more word in edgewise, to wind up passing them. But we'll see. If you have a prediction, go ahead.
It's really hard, I think, for the guys who are playing conference championship weekend to win the award. I was looking at recent winners. Of the last 8, 6 of them have played conference championship weekend. The exceptions were Travis Hunter, who was sort of a unicorn in a way with what he was able to do on both sides of the ball. Then Jaden Daniels didn't play in the SEC title game. But the previous years between those two and Lamar Jackson, you had just a stream of guys who sort of clinched the award by playing the conference championship weekend. Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, Bryce Young, all these guys had great performances in their conference title game, and that tended to sort of tip the scales in their favor. It kind of has become, in some ways, a 1 week or 1 or 2 weekend kind of race. If you get to rivalry week, conference championship week, you put yourself in a spot. You're either the team that leads. You're either the quarterback on a conference champion who leads their team into the playoff, or you just have these just amazingly unbelievable, freaky type numbers. And I don't think there's somebody in that latter category. It's probably why it's going to be Mendoza or Sayin.
It's just like I said. It feels like getting that last word, especially in a tight race, I think is just going to make a lot of difference. If you have a prediction, I'll happily take it. I mean, I made ours. I made mine on the podcast earlier this week. I said Ohio State 24, Indiana 19.
How did they get 19?
I said that Ohio State's going to force Indiana into a couple of field goals, and then maybe get to like a 21-13 situation, and Indiana's going to go for 2 to try and tie the game, not get it. Ohio, or 24-13, and Indiana scores a fourth quarter touchdown, that kind of thing. I was probably trying to just be a little different, but I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be low scoring. I think Indiana is up for the challenge in a way that it probably wasn't a year ago. And it obviously helps, too, that it's indoors. It's a neutral field. I know Ohio State people will travel, but obviously it's not like it will be a one-sided crowd either. I don't know how many Ohio State fans know Indiana's actually got a basketball game at 2 p.m. at Gainbridge Fieldhouse downtown. So there are going to be a lot of very spirited Indiana fans in downtown Indy who have been looking at this date for a while. I mean, I know a number of people who bought Big Ten championship game tickets like in the summer once the Louisville game was announced, thinking we'll do the double. And if we don't, I can almost certainly flip these tickets to an Ohio State fan or a Penn State fan or whoever. I think it's going to be a good game. I think it's going to live up to all our expectations, and I went for a close Ohio State win. I think the line is currently 4.5, so somebody's going to come out on the wrong end of my prediction if it stays there.
I'll get mine in a sec, but I do want to ask, what is for Indiana? I mean, I thought for a long time not to sound disparaging, but like this would be their Super Bowl to win the Big Ten championship in Indianapolis and to break a 3-decade losing streak to Ohio State. Just, I wouldn't want to say like the playoff would be gravy at that point, but what is your sense on like that?
I think listen, would it mean more to Indiana than Ohio State? I guess probably, right? Like Indiana hasn't won a Big Ten title since we started calling it the Big Ten Conference. As you say, it's been a long time since they beat Ohio State. It's been a long time since they won in the postseason period. They haven't won a bowl game since 1991. So for a whole host of reasons, like this would be a watershed moment. I do think last year sort of takes some of like the fairy tale off of it. Not that Indiana fans aren't still just sort of like, my God, look what IU football's become. But I think that there is, they have followed their head coach's lead in saying, fine, then, you're asking us to expect more of our football program than we will. And, that doesn't mean that Indiana expects 11 plus wins every single year. If we don't have to get into this today, certainly, but like if you look at Indiana's depth chart, they're going to lose a ton ahead of next season. There's going to be a lot of roster management to deal with in January and February. And I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana maybe regresses to like a 9-win team in 2026. I don't think anybody would be alarmed at that, if you understand what I'm saying. I think, though, this place, I think, has allowed itself to expect more of football, because of the way the last 2 years have gone. And also, because just frankly, I've said this to people who've asked, like, this is a football school now. And that's not to say basketball is not still popular and important. And, there will be plenty of Indiana fans in the Louisville game on Saturday afternoon. And, if Darren DeVries keeps kind of building this thing upward, then Assembly Hall will be full and rowdy all winter like it always is. But Indiana is or football is the sport that Indiana is coded for right now. It is where all the blood is flowing within the fan base, within the donor base. There's a lot of different factors involved in that. But like, this is not a basketball school just happy to be kind of in a football championship game. Like this is a team that has, because its head coach basically demanded it, learned to expect something from football. And, it's getting that right now. So I think, like, would it mean more to Indiana than Ohio State to win this? Probably, although I would point out, I'm not sure there's a player on Ohio State's roster who's won a Big Ten title. At least there aren't many. Because it's
Joey Velasquez, who transferred from Michigan.
Okay, so the point is, like,
experience of having played on both sides that rivalry.
Like we tend to treat this sort of stuff like it's Ohio State's birthright and they're bored of it, but I don't think anybody on this team is, right? But I think, like, from Indiana's perspective, I don't think Indiana fans would sort of, pack up and go home and just say, we don't care what happens in the playoff, all our prayers have been answered if they win Saturday night. I think they would look at it more as further validation of this guy came in and told us to stop being so defeatist and pessimistic and skeptical about football. And we did. And he immediately repaid our faith with all the things that he said he would. And so I think it would just be further validation of what Indiana fans believe, which is that, Curt Cignetti, the emerging superpower of college football, I don't know, we'll see. But that Indiana football is something significantly different now to what it's been, and that it's okay for everyone to expect that going forward.
It would not be a house money stage.
No, I don't think so. Especially because if they won, they go to the Rose Bowl. And I think Indiana fans would look at the Rose Bowl the same way. And I know that one might not mean as much to Ohio State because they won it literally last year. But, I think there would be almost that sort of, like, I think that fans would become justifiably greedy then too, of like, well, let's not just win a Big Ten title. Let's go win a Rose Bowl. Never done that before. Now we're in the national semifinal. Like, at a certain point, it should all become gravy, right? Like, if you're consistently in national semifinals, like, I know it doesn't always work this way, but you should be able to recognize that at a certain point, these games become, toss-ups and just getting there, constantly giving yourself that platform and that stage is what matters. But I don't think Indiana fans would just sort of, like I said, just pack up and sort of say that's our season, then I think they'd frankly just say, all right, well then let's raise the bar again, because that's what Curt Cignetti has told them to do. And, every time they've done what he told them to do, he responded with more. And so the learned behavior is just keep following the piper up the mountain, I guess.
Such a fascinating coach. Just listening to him this week, just the clarity in which he speaks.
He's he's like I say to people, he's a lot of fun to cover. I know that, we always reduce coaches to like sound bites and stuff. Growing up in the South, I was always hesitant to make the Saban comparisons because I know, like the connotation there. But I do think that's a relevant one, because I think you see a lot of, what made Nick Saban teams at Alabama so good was just that attention to detail, that hyper focus on all the small things that, really well coached football teams do well, that wind up adding up to victories. The other one he reminds me of a little bit, maybe more culturally relevant to like where this program was, is Steve Spurrier. In that ability to infuse a program with a certain character and a certain confidence. It's obviously a little bit different. Spurrier went to Florida, obviously. But when I was growing up, like Florida was the villain in the SEC every year because nobody could beat him. Georgia couldn't beat him. Tennessee couldn't beat him. Auburn couldn't beat him. The years, every once in a while, Alabama would pop up and be good. But obviously the 90s and 2000s, Alabama spent a lot of time in the wilderness. But those Spurrier Florida teams just never apologized for anything. And if you beat them, you beat them. But they never lost faith in their coach, in their attitude, and their process. And I think this team, it's not like they walk out talking a ton of trash or anything. They have all the confidence that their head coach has, that they're going to have the success that he talks about. And even last year, like I remember when they beat Northwestern to go 6-0, it was Mikael Kamara who was saying, I know you all think this is great, and it is. Bowl games are great, but like we're here to win a national championship. Like this is not the end. And then after, at the end of last season, Aiden Fisher was standing at the podium or sitting or whatever, I don't know if it was standing or sitting in Notre Dame Stadium saying, we're going to be right back here next year and we're going to be better. Like I guarantee you that. They all believe it because their head coach gets them to. And every time, that belief is tested, they come through. So I just think that, frankly, they will keep raising the bar as far as their head coach tells them to.
The villain comparison is interesting because I sort of view Indiana as they've gone from the nuisance stage among Ohio State fans to a little bit of the respect stage. And if they were to pull off a win on Saturday night, then they would I think slowly then move into villain stage, because there would inevitably be some sort of post-game comment from somebody that would offend somebody. some sort of sharp barb or elbow,
and that somebody would very possibly be Paul Feinbaum. Do you have a prediction for this?
Yeah, I picked 28-20, low scoring, I think, as well. I just think these defenses do a great job of keeping the other from avoiding the big play, and Ohio State has just showed so few vulnerabilities this year, and just the way they've dominated teams, it's hard to pick against them. I think the X factor to me is just what kind of start do they get in this game. This is being played a week after they beat Michigan, and all the emotion that goes into that rivalry, and to snap a 4-game losing streak for Ryan Day to get the monkey off his back, to get their first win over Michigan since his first year in 19. And you look at the way Ohio State's performed in the Big Ten title game in the past. They've had some slow starts. They trailed both Northwestern in 20 and Wisconsin in 19 at halftime of those games. So if there is some sort of emotional letdown coming back to earth after the high of beating Michigan, I wonder if that could give Indiana an opening. I wouldn't be surprised if Ohio State's even trailing at halftime, but I just think over 60 minutes, they're just so tough to beat right now, and they are just kind of moving through the schedule with such ease, and control that I just have a hard time seeing them losing it.
That's like that is, if Indiana could get into that position, like when Indiana gets teams chasing them on the scoreboard, that's when teams really start to get into trouble. And that's been at the most extreme end. That's been when they've beaten bad teams like UCLA and Maryland, but even like Oregon, they got out ahead of Oregon. They kicked that field goal at the end of the first half. And then can't remember if they scored on their first or their second drive after halftime, but you could just feel like Oregon really kind of getting away from itself, and it's like its best self, because it sort of looked up and felt like, hey, it's getting late early, and these guys are showing a lot more capacity to score on us than we are on them. And that's when, even in the games where the run game hasn't necessarily been like hyper productive, it's remained explosive enough to maybe turn a 3-and-out into maybe a couple first downs, or to convert like a 2nd and long, and suddenly you flip field position. Indiana's at its best when, most teams are this way, but I think particularly with the way Indiana plays defense, as disruptive as they are, as aggressive as they are, Indiana's at its best when you are chasing Indiana, because that's when you start taking chances, when you start feeling like you got to take some risks. That's when Indiana really hurts you. And if Indiana could get into a place where like second half they're up multiple scores, that's where, and I'm not sure they can, obviously, but if they could, then that's where I think Indiana would feel like really at home, saying, let's go play our game and maybe we can beat these guys. So
even a touchdown lead or a 10-point lead would be mildly interesting. Ohio State has not trailed by more than 6 points all year. That 6-0 lead Michigan had in the first quarter was Ohio State's largest deficit this year. They hadn't trailed by more than a field goal until that point. We have not seen them play from behind at all this season, really, and they've not trailed the second half. I think that would present some interesting or different circumstances for just the way they would try to operate. It'd be much easier to tee off on somebody like Julian saying they've not been in any sort of situation where they've had to take risks, as you said. They've just always been in control of games this year.
He's Joey Kaufman. I'm Zach Osterman. I guess a disclaimer here at the end. We're recording this on Tuesday, probably posting it on Thursday. So if something happens between now and then, please forgive us. But this has been a BuckeyeXtra Mind Your Banners sort of USA Today company cross network special. Joey, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you all for listening or watching. If you've been watching on the YouTube channel. Next stop is Lucas Oil Stadium at 8 p.m. Saturday night. I know you will all be there, and we will see you there. Thanks so much.